What begins as an ordinary morning transforms into something extraordinary. An African-American woman enters a federal courthouse, steady and dignified, completely unaware she's about to face degradation from those meant to protect justice. They assume she's nobody special, just another person passing through their system. They humiliate her, mock her, and believe they'll escape consequences. What they fail to realize is crucial. They've targeted the wrong person. She isn't just any citizen. She's the individual with authority to tear down their corrupt system legally, publicly, and permanently. What unfolds next becomes a tempest of accountability and a courtroom revelation nobody anticipated. The clock had just passed 18:88 a.m. when Marilyn Carter emerged from her metallic gray Honda and approached the entrance of Boston's Thomas P. O'Neill Federal Building. Morning sunshine reflected off the structure's brick and glass exterior, creating lengthy shadows along the pavement. She paused briefly, adjusted her cream-colored blouse, and gripped her thin leather briefcase firmly. Her footsteps echoed softly, each one representing earned confidence, not borrowed authority. Judge Carter never donned her judicial robes beyond the courtroom walls. This was her principle. She preferred entering spaces as an ordinary citizen first, alert and proud, without ceremonial garments to provide protection. That particular morning, however, nobody addressed her with "Your Honor." No acknowledgement, no recognition, simply another black woman in a federal facility where authority had historically belonged to different faces. As she approached the security checkpoint, the atmosphere changed. Officer Carl Dobbs, a veteran, courthouse guard, noticed her approach. Former military background, crew-cut hairstyle, approaching 60, carrying morning coffee and absolute certainty. He didn't acknowledge her, didn't welcome her, just squinted suspiciously and gestured firmly. "Ma'am?" he commanded sharply. "Step this way, please." Marilyn stopped. "Something wrong?" Dobbs inhaled slowly, deliberately. "We've experienced contraband problems lately," he stated, "requiring additional screening." Marilyn cocked her head slightly. "You examined my identification?" "I observed a woman entering without appropriate authorization," he replied. "That's sufficient for me." Maintaining composure, she retrieved her credentials and displayed them clearly. The badge caught the fluorescent lighting. Federal Judge, First Circuit. He accepted it but didn't examine the details, simply tucked it into his shirt pocket like a grocery receipt. "Come with me." Before she could protest, he pivoted and strode down a corridor. She followed, tension building in her jaw. He guided her into an adjacent room, sterile, bare, harshly lit. A portable table stood against one wall. A surveillance camera blinked overhead. The space contained a chair, a handheld metal detector, and something concerning. Large scissors. "Remove your jacket," Dobbs demanded. "Absolutely not," Marilyn responded firmly. "You lack legal grounds for detention, and that badge you confiscated proves it." He remained unmoved. "Then I'll assist you." Before she could react, he seized her blouse collar, the garment her deceased mother had gifted her on confirmation day, and with one brutal, uneven tear, sliced straight through the fabric. Buttons scattered, seams separated. Her shirt fell, open, exposing her undergarment. Her breathing hitched, but she refused to cry out. Behind Dobbs, a young female officer watched in horror. She remained silent, paralyzed. Dobbs released the destroyed material and sneered. "Appears you're cleared." Marilyn's voice remained steady. "You've just committed assault against a federal judge," he chuckled. "Right, sure I did." She retrieved her identification from his desk without permission and moved toward the exit. He didn't intervene, just lounged against the table as though nothing occurred. "Courtrooms are that direction," he called mockingly. She departed, her blouse barely secured by one remaining button. Passers-by noticed her. Some stared, others averted their eyes. She maintained her pace without faltering. Upon reaching her chambers, the silence felt suffocating. Her judicial robe draped over her chair back, impeccably arranged. She didn't summon assistance, didn't contact security, didn't weep. She donned the robe methodically, precisely like protective armor, then gathered the case files and returned to the hallway. Further down the corridor, Courtroom 4B's entrance loomed ahead. Inside, capacity crowds had assembled. A significant hearing concerning police brutality allegations during Boston's previous year's Freedom March had attracted media, activists, and the city's legal establishment. Everyone expected the judge to enter through the private entrance, robed and composed. Instead, that morning, Marilyn Carter pushed through the main entrance, walking before 100 pairs of eyes with her torn collar visible and every detail of her experience written across her expression. Word spread quickly. She wasn't a spectator. She wasn't a victim. She was the presiding judge, and everything was about to change. The courtroom fell silent. Marilyn Carter's heels clicked against polished floors as she walked past rows of lawyers, litigants, journalists, and court staff, all struck speechless by her appearance. She offered no announcements, provided no explanations. She simply proceeded to the bench, beyond the shocked expressions, beyond papers that stopped rustling mid-motion, beyond Officer Dobbs himself, who stood motionless at the side entrance, clipboard in hand and growing realization weighing on his shoulders. Her robe flowed as she faced the assembly. Her damaged blouse remained visible underneath, torn, frayed, violated. Her expression, however, stayed unreadable, composed not from peace, but from determination. She lifted the gavel and struck once. This court is now in session. A collective, stiffening and sharp intake swept the room. Everyone, including those who hadn't grasped what they witnessed, now understood they were observing history. The first matter called was United States versus Lowell Police Department. The accusations were severe: excessive force, illegal detention, intimidation, and systematic abuse during the previous year's Government Center demonstration. Several officers occupied the defense table, professional in expensive suits, glancing uncertainly toward the judge. They had witnessed her entrance, seen the torn clothing beneath her robe, but the full significance hadn't registered. Marilyn's voice remained unwavering as she recognized all parties and permitted the prosecutor to commence. Witnesses testified. A black university student described being forced face down on asphalt for chanting. A military veteran, hands shaking, recounted being knocked down while protecting his daughter. One by one, their testimonies resonated throughout the courtroom like thunder. Throughout everything, Officer Dobbs remained motionless. When Marilyn briefly glanced toward him, his mouth opened wordlessly. She didn't react, didn't falter. Her focus returned to the witness stand. Her pen moved continuously, each notation sharp and accurate. When the first break was announced, the gallery erupted, not loudly but in understanding. Reporters grabbed phones, speaking urgently, some typing frantically. Headlines quickly appeared. On social media, Judge Carter apparently assault victim. Presides over police misconduct case in damaged clothing. Inside the courtroom, murmurs increased. Staff whispered in corners. A bailiff passed Dobbs without acknowledgement. He was no longer protected. The foundation had cracked. Marilyn remained at the bench, unmoved. 15 minutes later, proceedings resumed. The second witness, a young Latino paramedic, spoke passionately. He had attempted helping a protester struggling to breathe, only to be pushed by an officer and threatened with arrest for interference. They didn't want assistance, he testified. They wanted submission. Marilyn nodded deliberately, not merely as a judge but as someone who comprehended silencing. She posed questions then, her voice precise, her manner intentional. Was threatening medical personnel standard procedure? The paramedic hesitated. Not officially, she raised an eyebrow. But unofficially? He exhaled. Yes, ma'am. She allowed the silence to linger, then addressed the prosecution. Please continue. By mid-morning, the courthouse had transformed beyond a mere legal building. It had become a crucible. Outside, news cameras gathered. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken but undeniable truth. The robe no longer concealed reality. When Marilyn called another recess, The room remained partially seated, uncertain whether to stand, speak, or simply absorb the moment. That's when she spoke his name, Officer Carl Dobbs. He stepped forward. The summons wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. Dobbs hesitated, gripping his clipboard tighter. "Your Honor," he stammered. "Now," she stated with finality. He moved to the courtroom's center, eyes darting nervously. "State your name for the record." Carl Dobbs." "Length of service at this courthouse?" 18 years. She tapped her pen twice. "During those 18 years, how many women have you subjected to illegal searches?" He blinked. "Your Honor, I—" "Answer the question." "None." "That's incorrect," she replied coldly. "Because this morning in that screening room, without justification or authority, you destroyed the clothing of a federal judge. Mine." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. "You didn't request my name. You didn't verify my credentials. You violated protocol, policy, and federal law. And you acted without hesitation." Dobbs opened his mouth. No words emerged. "How many complaints have been filed against you?" I'm not sure." "I am. 11 formal complaints, all dismissed. How many were suppressed?" Dobbs didn't respond. Marilyn rose slowly, hands on the bench, robe draping like a banner of war. "Because of you and others like you, this building, a place meant to represent justice, has become a theater of intimidation." She addressed the attending officers. "Arrest Mr. Dobbs immediately. Do not place him in general population. Charges will follow." 2 officers approached. "Wait, please, wait," Dobbs shouted, but it was finished. The courtroom watched as the man who once guarded the entrance now walked in shackles. No applause followed, only silence, deep, respectful, awestruck. When Marilyn resumed her seat, it was with authority no robe alone could provide. She turned to the clerk. "Is the docket prepared?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Then we continue." The next witness brought the courtroom to another painful edge. A local educator in her early 40s described watching her students thrown to the ground during a peaceful march. "Attempted to speak," she said, "but when I did, I was handcuffed in front of my class." Her voice cracked. "My students stopped believing in justice that day." Marilyn leaned forward. "Do you believe in it now?" "Today." The teacher considered, looking directly at her. "I think I'm beginning to." The judge didn't smile, but something in her expression softened momentarily. Outside the courtroom, news had spread rapidly. "Judge Carter orders courthouse officers. Arrest mid-trial," flashed across CNN. By noon, demonstrators had assembled in the plaza. Signs were raised high, "Protect Black Women," "End the Silence," "The Bench Speaks." But Marilyn Carter hadn't acted for publicity. She hadn't addressed reporters. She had simply performed her duty. And finally, the world had chosen to observe. As the lunch break concluded, Marilyn remained in chambers, quiet. A sealed folder lay before her, marked confidential, delivered by the administrative officer. Inside, documents, complaints, emails, signatures, 11 previous grievances against Officer Dobbs, each marked unsubstantiated or no action required, all bearing the same signature. Judge Lionel Ford, her former mentor, the man who once claimed she was too emotional for the judiciary. She studied his signature repeatedly, then turned to the final page. A handwritten memo. "Dobbs may be aggressive, but he controls certain people. Leave him alone." Marilyn didn't weep, didn't rage. She simply closed the folder and stood. The courtroom filled once more. This time, the energy had transformed. No longer merely a trial, no longer just testimony. This was metamorphosis, and Marilyn Carter, scarred, unshaken, undeniable, was leading it. When Judge Marilyn Carter returned to the bench, the courtroom had fundamentally changed from that morning. The gallery rose not merely from tradition, but from something deeper. Respect earned in real time. She didn't wait for the clerk's announcement. She simply entered, her robe flowing like a shadow of what had been taken from her hours earlier, and assumed her position as if the chair had always belonged to her, because it had. The atmosphere remained charged, reverent. Marilyn struck the gavel once, and every conversation ceased instantly. The prosecution rose to call their next witness, Reverend Elijah Booker, a man in his late 60s, a civil rights legend in Massachusetts and longtime community advocate. He walked deliberately, assisted by a cane, but his voice held no weakness. "Your Honor, I've waited 3 decades to testify in a courtroom that finally felt like one," he said. He described years of harassment during peaceful assemblies, always dismissed as procedural misunderstandings, always buried under claims of security necessity. He had submitted complaints. He had been ignored. "And now," he said, turning directly to Marilyn, "you've reminded them what justice looks like in human form." She nodded once, silently, allowing his words to settle like dust on stone. The defense attorneys had grown increasingly uncomfortable, whispering, conferring, exchanging worried glances with their clients. One finally stood and approached the bench. "Your Honor, we request a recess to discuss a motion for judicial recusal based on perceived conflict of interest." Marilyn leaned forward slowly. "You're suggesting I'm unqualified to oversee a case involving systematic law enforcement abuse because I, a federal judge, was just subjected to systematic law enforcement abuse?" The attorney shifted, eyes flickering. "We simply want to preserve court integrity." "You mean the appearance of integrity?" she said sharply. "The same integrity this court lost when you defended officers like Dobbs for decades?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. "Request denied. Your motion may be filed, but it won't delay these proceedings. You may be seated." Her tone was like steel. The attorney complied. The gallery didn't cheer. They didn't need to. The power dynamic had already shifted, and everyone recognized it. Additional testimony followed, each voice more penetrating than the last. A social worker, a former bailiff, a teenage girl pepper-sprayed during a peaceful sit-in, her voice barely audible but crystal clear. Marilyn remained composed, present, absorbing everything, not just as a judge but as a witness herself. In the quiet intervals between testimonies, the weight of long-suppressed truth became impossible to ignore. Mid-afternoon, a clerk entered with a sealed envelope. Marilyn opened it, scanning the contents. A letter from the Department of Justice. They were launching a comprehensive investigation into courthouse personnel based on reports and public footage of the morning's incident. Beneath it, another document, official notice that Judge Lionel Ford had submitted his resignation, citing health concerns. She said nothing aloud but folded the papers carefully, then looked up at the packed courtroom and made a decision. "We are entering into the record all formal complaints previously filed against Officer Carl Dobbs," she announced. "These include internal correspondence, supervisory signatures, and the identities of those who facilitated their dismissal." A defense attorney began to rise in objection. She raised her hand. "Sit down." He froze. "Let the record show that this court is no longer protecting predators or silencing victims. Let the record show that silence is no longer neutrality. It is complicity." The courtroom was silent. Even reporters had stopped typing. No one wanted to miss a word. "The justice system will never be perfect," she said, "but from this moment forward in this courtroom, it will be present." In the final hour of proceedings, Marilyn introduced a new policy proposal: mandatory anti-bias training for all courthouse personnel, psychological evaluations every 2 years, and zero tolerance for discrimination of any kind. "This is called the Carter Protocol," she said, "and I will take it to the circuit, to Congress, and beyond, because what happened to me should never happen to anyone, and it will never happen again. Not in this house." Heads nodded slowly throughout the room. A few hands gripped armrests. A tear rolled down the cheek of a woman in the second row who had once filed a complaint that was never acknowledged. When Marilyn looked at her, she smiled for the first time that day, small but genuine. Then came the sentencing. Officer Dobbs, now stripped of badge and authority, was led into the courtroom in handcuffs, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He stood before the bench, unable to meet her gaze. Marilyn stared at him, not with vengeance, but with clarity. "Carl Dobbs," she said, "this court finds you guilty of abuse of power, civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and unlawful use of force against a federal officer." The room didn't stir. "You are hereby sentenced to 6 years in federal prison without parole. You will be processed immediately, and for the record, your behavior is not an anomaly. It is the product of a system that chose silence over accountability. That system begins to end today." Dobbs didn't speak. He didn't even look up. He was escorted out as quietly as he had entered. There was no celebration, no applause, just reverent stillness, the kind that follows something irreversible. Marilyn removed her robe slowly, folded it over her arm, and stepped down from the bench. She didn't return to chambers. She walked straight to the doors, past her staff, past the reporters, and into the afternoon sunshine. Outside, the crowd had grown. Protesters, students, community elders, all assembled in the square. When she stepped onto the courthouse steps, they didn't cheer. They stood. A collective breath. A moment of recognition. A young woman approached her quietly and extended a piece of paper. A handwritten list of names. Each one a person who had suffered in silence for years. "They're ready to testify now," she said. Marilyn nodded and accepted it gently. That night, Marilyn returned home and stood before her bathroom mirror. The blouse was gone, her shoulders bare. The day had left marks, not on her body, but on her spirit. Her reflection didn't show weakness, it showed survival. Her phone buzzed. A text from a clerk. "They're calling you the judge who didn't flinch." She smiled, but only briefly. She wasn't seeking titles. She was seeking change. In the weeks that followed, the Carter Protocol was adopted in 2 other districts. A congressional committee requested her testimony, and at a middle school in Dorchester, students created a bulletin board reading, "Be like Judge Carter." One day during a civics lesson, a student raised her hand and asked, "Is justice a place?" The teacher paused, then answered, "No, but sometimes a person can make it feel like one." Months later, the headlines would fade. But in one federal building, in Boston, a robe still hung on the back of a chair, not as a shield but as a reminder that power is not in the symbols we wear, but in the truth we defend. Marilyn Carter didn't set out to become a symbol. She set out to do her job, and in doing so, she redefined what the job meant. She walked those courthouse halls, not louder, not faster, but fuller, with the weight of every silenced voice now walking beside her. And when the next hearing began and she stepped into the courtroom, everyone stood, not because the clerk instructed them to, but because they knew. Justice had arrived, and this time it looked exactly as it should.